find you guilty, traitor. The Republic demands your head.
The fate of the woman France had come to hate was set before the blade even touched her neck. Taking her life was insufficient. Her identity had to be erased and made into a humiliating public spectacle. Once a dazzling Archduchess of Austria, Marie Antoinette was now being made to tread the way backward from the magnificence of a gilded throne to the rough wooden cart destined for the condemned. Her laughter had illuminated the halls of Versailles. If you're attracted to actual, subscribe to a history where innocence is silently lost. It's not a myth. It's the gradual disintegration of a young lady whom the world has chosen to despise. Marie Antoinette was just a young girl, terrified, alone, and already sentenced before the cries and the blade. Stay with me and leave a comment indicating where you're watching. Because the tragedy wasn't her execution. It was much worse than what came before it. While Paris was still hidden under a thick veil of stillness in the early hours of August 2, 1793, she was torn from her family's arms. She was taken to the Conciergerie, a dank, dark prison that Parisians ominously dubbed the Guillotine's waiting room, after being torn away from her kids and denied even a brief moment of solace. Only prisoner number 280 remained, and the Queen had vanished. Rats, perspiring stone walls, and 2 unblinking guards made up her new court. Every action was captured, and every meager effort at self-respect was thwarted. Under the ceiling's continuous dripping, the hours blended together, mingled with the hushed murmurs of other inmates waiting to be released. Another story was being told within that jail, as the revolution roared outside and those who had previously bowed before her silks now called for her execution. The tale of the woman who created the emblem. Before she reached the scaffold, a woman was forced to confront not just death, but also a conscious attempt to break her spirit. This is the account of what they did to Marie Antoinette prior to her execution by guillotine. In this tale, humiliation and dignity fought, and she found her ultimate crown in the most improbable place, the silent endurance of agony. Clocks no longer dictated time. The distant whisper of the wind brushing on stone and the thud of guard boots served as indicators. Moisture clung to everything, including her own skin, the walls, and the blankets in Marie Antoinette's little, soggy cage. Her bed was a heap of straw. There was only one candle to accompany her. The chamber was partially separated by a wooden screen, and behind. Even this sliver of solitude was prohibited, even though she was supposed to dress and undress. She was denied the right to remain invisible while 2 soldiers kept vigil day and night. She dozed off beneath their gaze. In front of them, she ate. It was more than just control surveillance. It served as a reminder that she was merely a body under watch, no longer a mother or queen, and hardly even regarded as human. Outside news dissolved into warped muttering, reverberations from a world that had forgotten about her. However, painfully, remembrance persisted. One wound that would not go away. The memories of Louis Charles, her son. Only a month before, rebels had broken into his room after midnight in the temple prison and looked for the young prince. "He's only a child." Marie Antoinette had flung herself over him, frantically begging, but her prayers were in vain. The frightened 8-year-old was pulled from her arms as the guards ripped her away. His shouts continued to play incessantly in her head. The shadows. She would never again see him. That night, something inside her broke. Not the queen, but the mother. She kept a small portrait of her son and a lock of his hair in her corset, among the few items she concealed from the guards. It was her relic, the final glimmer of tenderness in an angry world. Rosalie Lealier, a young servant who was tasked with taking care of her, was the only person who showed her compassion. Later, Rosalie admitted that the queen only became upset when she mentioned her kids. Then the royal facade came down, exposing a distraught mother praying as she whispered the names of her children. Even this weakness turned into a game for her captors. They made fun of her, made crude remarks to insult her, and made fun of her husband's execution. Every slight was intended to cause her pain. She tried to resist every time she was silent. However, in that oppressive confinement, surrounded by animosity, Marie Antoinette started to turn her suffering into resistance. She discovered how to speak quietly, walk gently, and not be afraid. Those observing her anticipated a broken woman. Rather, they witnessed a someone who possessed an odd, implicit power despite being devoid of a crown and title. She occasionally gazed at the quivering flame of her candle as the rest slept. She relived every moment of her life in its dim light. The lavish parties, the gowns with embroidery, her kids giggling in the palace gardens, and the growing bitterness that had been building just outside Versailles. When had it all started to fall apart? When did they cease to be human and turn into signs of animosity? Dawn was the only response that ever came. Another day inside that small stone coffin came along with it. Beyond the walls, she heard the city vendors yelling, revolutionary drums, the distant bells of NRAM, reminding her that life went on without her. And so 76 days passed, 76 dawns without hope. During those long weeks, the woman, once hated by an entire nation, was stripped of everything that made her human. But something unexpected emerged from that stripping. A quiet, almost sacred composure, a dignity that appears only in those who have lost everything and have nothing left to fear. Then, in October, the cell door opened again, but this time it was to take Marie Antoinette to trial rather than to take a child. On October 14, 1793, in the dark hours before dawn, the iron door opened again, not for food or more guard jeers, but to drag her before the justice of the revolution, which had already been carved in stone before she entered the room. The Revolutionary Tribunal, packed with spectators, looked more like a stage than a courtroom. Flickering torches lit the corridors of the Conciergerie, surrounded by armed soldiers whose boots echoed against the stone like distant funeral drums. She wore the same black dress she had worn to mourn her executed husband, but her steps remained calm, almost unnervingly composed. People peered at her from shadowed corners, some spitting insults, others just staring, caught between fear and fascination. Prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville opened the proceedings with a voice meant for spectacle, his words dripping with malice, every sentence crafted to provoke roars from the crowd, and the woman who had once been Queen of France sat across from them on a plain wooden bench, their faces as rigid and expressionless as carved marble, no jewels now, no crown, just a thin, pale figure with a ghost-like dignity that refused to fade. Every sentence evoked waves of applause, jeers, and pounding fists. However, no one gave a damn about the facts. The revolution needed a villain, a body to which years of starvation, taxes, and war could be pinned, and she was the chosen symbol. Marie Antoinette, who was denied adequate legal representation and had no time to prepare, spoke only when permitted. Her voice was steady and quiet. She denied the charges, not in indignation but with the fatigue of. The accusation that froze the entire room came after witnesses filed in one after another. Some recounted stories taken directly from hate-filled pamphlets, while others made up stories on the spot. They talked about extravagant feasts, mocking banquets, and excesses at Versailles. The audience howled in approval, feeding on each made-up scandal. The prosecutor held up a sheet of paper, paused dramatically, and delivered the most heinous charge of all that she had done. Word spread through the gallery that little Lizzie Charles, who had been torn from her arms months earlier, had been forced to sign a false confession after being coached to repeat horrifying phrases he couldn't even understand. Sentences meant to break the mother who loved him. Incest with her own son. A chilling silence swept over the tribunal. Even some seasoned revolutionaries dropped their gaze. Marie Antoinette seemed carved from stone, staring into nothing for a moment. The audience held their breath as she stood up, turning away from the prosecutor and the jury to face the women in the bat market. Women, mothers, the same ones who had marched to her side demanding bread, and said, "I appeal to all the mothers who are here." She didn't need to explain herself, and a wave of gasps, tears, and murmurs swept through the crowd. For a moment, the hideous caricature from the pamphlets was replaced by. The trial dragged on for 2 days, a meticulously planned demonstration of revolutionary power. Every question, every witness, every scrap of evidence. The truth, a mother torn from her child, humiliated beyond comprehension. Tinville, angry at the change in mood, slammed his fist on the table and forced the proceedings onward, but something had cracked. A flicker of guilt or perhaps humanity passed across a few faces in the room. Marie Antoinette sank back into her seat, exhausted. Was a part of a play with a predetermined conclusion. The judges declared the defendant guilty of high treason at daybreak on October 16th and sentenced him to execution by guillotine. When the clerk asked her if she had anything to say, she only shook her head and muttered, "What more could I add?" There was no yelling, no pleading, no resentment, just a woman standing taller than the men who condemned, but in that instant, her silent acceptance turned into its own kind of resistance. On October 15th, 1793, night fell over Paris, casting a deceptive calm over cell number 280 of the Conciergerie. The silence was so heavy that even the dripping water sounded like a clock marking her last hours. Marie Antoinette returned from her trial pale and trembling, but her silence carried more honesty than anything said in the courtroom. That afternoon, she was led back to her cell, with the crowd's triumphant cries, accusations, and cheers behind her. Rosalie, her faithful attendant, remained near her and offered her bread and broth, but the queen declined with a soft smile, saying, "I need nothing more, my child. Everything is finished for me." She sat at the small wooden table for a long time, watching shadows dance across the damp wall while the Seine whispered outside and guards paced beyond the door. Then she picked up a quill and sheet of paper. Her hand shook, but her gaze seemed oddly peaceful. Her tone softened as she wrote a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, the only person left to whom she felt genuinely attached. She wrote about forgiveness rather than retaliation, fear, or the injustice she had experienced. She pleaded with her sister-in-law to take care of her daughter, to pray for little Louis Charles, and to never hold him accountable for the words he had been forced to repeat because he had been deceived and used as a pawn by those who wished to torment her. She put the quill down and looked at the candle, saying, "Accuse him. Tell him I pray for him. Tell him that even in heaven, I will still be his mother." With each sentence, it seemed as though her spirit was gradually separating from her weary body. The letter became her moral testament, her last message to the world, but it never made it to its intended recipient. Instead, revolutionaries took it and buried it in their archives of hatred, where it was hidden for more than 20 years before being discovered. Our midnight footsteps returned. The final order had arrived. The guards delivered it in a tone so cold and ordinary that it could have been a breakfast announcement. Marie Antoinette simply nodded. There was no tremor of fear, no plea for mercy. Melted wax trailed across the table like falling tears. Rosalie noticed it too and broke down. "Do not cry," the queen told her softly. "We must die as we have lived decently." She prayed on her knees, not for herself but for her children. She was no monarch, no symbol, just a mother getting ready to let go. By the time she got up, dawn was sneaking through the wall crack. Paris was waking up, unconcerned with her grief, and in the streets, people talked about bread, politics, and the impending execution, not realizing that the woman, who had once been the focal point of Europe's most opulent court, was quietly adjusting her hair, wiping her cheeks, and getting ready. The candle went out, its last glow hovering in the darkness like a fading promise. Marie Antoinette did not dream when the cell was swallowed by night. Instead, she simply waited until sunrise, when the clanging of bolts signaled the end of waiting. After a brief period of sleep, Rosie heard her murmur, "May God give me the strength to die with courage." The day had finally arrived, the day that France's most despised woman would demonstrate the strength of her soul one last time. Paris woke up in 1793 in a thick, freezing fog, as if even the sky was hesitant to see what the next few hours would bring. The former queen, who had only slept for a few minutes, woke up in cell 280 before the guards arrived, her head resting on the same table where the unread letter was still lying. Rosalie, with swollen eyes and a cup of water, asked, "Would you like breakfast, Your Majesty?" Marie Antoinette shook her head gently. "No. Once I am gone, I need nothing more. My soul has fed enough on sorrow." At exactly 6 o'clock, the locks changed in the morning, the door opened, and the jailer said bluntly, "It is time." 3 men, a clerk, a National Guard officer, and the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, with his helpers, entered behind him. Everything had been planned down to the last detail, a ritual of removing her last remaining bits of dignity. A guard told her she needed to change, and the directive was straightforward: take off the black mourning dress she had worn since her husband's passing. She asked quietly for privacy, saying, "Sir, please allow me at least that." The guard laughed. "There are no queens here." She was made to change behind a poorly placed screen while they watched, and they handed her a plain, rough white linen gown, the color worn by penitents on the brink of death, because the dress was more than just fabric. It was her memory, her symbol, and the last thread that connected her to the life that had been stolen. The contrast was harsh. The woman who had previously worn silk and jewels now appeared almost spectral in. When she was done, Sanson moved forward and said, "Your hair must be cut, madam." She didn't object. Instead, she just bowed her head. Her hands, which had previously been adorned with jewels and rings, folded silently over her skirt. One of her assistants grabbed rusty scissors and viciously hacked off strands of her hair, leaving white strands on the floor like remnants of her past. Her once blonde hair had turned pale in prison, bleached by grief and time. A guard carrying a thick rope said, "We must bind your hands." Marie Antoinette looked up in shock. Why? Her husband, the king, was not bound, and her voice was solemn rather than rebellious. No response was given, and she swallowed a sound of pain as her wrists were tied so tightly that the rope bit into her skin. Before departing, she made a request that had previously been unthinkable for a queen. "May I relieve myself for a moment?" They nodded. The men straightened when she returned to the room, and Sanson said solemnly, "We must go." Marie Antoinette stopped in front of Rosalie, and the young woman shuddered, unable to speak, and the queen gave her a tender look. "Do not weep for me," she said. "Humiliation was complete. I've been through too much to be afraid of dying. God bless you." She then proceeded to the hallway, where murmurs reverberated throughout the conciergerie. Footsteps and fear. The guards took off their hats as she got closer, and no one dared to look her in the eyes. It wasn't fear, rather, it was an unconscious respect. Something about her presence demanded silence. When she arrived at the main gate, she saw the cart waiting for her, an open, rough wooden wagon, the same kind used for thieves and criminals, and there were no exceptions for her. Her husband had been taken to his death in a closed carriage, and she was put on display. The bells of NRAM blended with the rising shouts of people already crowding the streets as she climbed into the cart without assistance, her wrists still bound. For a moment, she raised her face toward the gray sky, took a deep breath, and whispered words only Rosalie could hear, "Now my peace begins." The courthouse doors groaned open, and the cart started rolling through the crowd. Jazz, insults, and laughter chased after her, but she remained upright and motionless, as if she was no longer a part of the living world. The final journey to the Plaster Revolution had begun, and the wooden cart, pulled by 2 weary horses, creaked through the streets of Paris, its sides stained with mud and the traces of past prisoners. Marie Antoinette stood tall inside the cart, her freshly cut hair and plain white gown tugged by the wind, looking like the final act in a tragedy whose conclusion everyone already knew. The slow ride from the conciergerie to the square took just over an hour, and for the thousands lining the roadsides, it felt like a procession. Some threw insults, others threw stale bread, and they yelled, "There goes the widow, Cape, and the Austrian, the thief of France." However, it was her silence that most onlookers found disturbing, not her presence, but the fact that she did not react, bow her head, or cry. Instead, her expression remained composed, her posture unbent, her gaze fixed far ahead, and the cold wind blowing through her cropped hair did not shake her. Artists and chroniclers later. Jacques David, the revolutionary painter, opened his sketchbook and traced her outline, the long neck, the firm jaw, the hollow yet serene eyes, trying to capture not just her figure but the exact moment when history and myth intertwined. He wrote that her profile that day did not reflect arrogance, but a solemn, unsettling calm, a woman who had already made peace with her ending. A young man with sharp features watched intently from a balcony. That sketch would go on to become one of the most iconic representations. Under the clatter of hooves, vendor cries, and church bells, the city seemed to hold its breath. A gust of wind swelled dust into the air. The cart jolted violently over a stone. Marie Antoinette stumbled, almost falling. A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. The cart continued along Rue Saint-Honor guarded by lines of soldiers. Windows opened and slammed shut as it passed. Some watched her with open hatred, while others with a restrained guilty respect. "She doesn't look afraid," one whispered. "Perhaps she has nothing left to lose." The market women, the same women who had once marched to Versailles, demanding bread, watched her intently from nearby, some smirking cruelly, others staring silently. She raised her chin as if nothing had happened. The trip seemed to go on forever. She was surrounded like a cyclone by the noise of the metropolis. But she was motionless within. She experienced something different while the audience witnessed a humiliated queen. Anything surprising. She felt liberated for the first time in years. Free of politics, the court, hateful gossip, expectations, and even fear itself. The sight unfolded in front of her as the cart rounded one last corner. The revolution in plaster. The guillotine stood in the middle, looming against the white sky. In the midday light, the shiny metal blade and dark wooden frame made a sharp silhouette. The platform was surrounded by a sizable crowd that was giddy with excitement. A roar rose from their murmur. "Marie Antoinette raised her chin. Everything else vanished for a second. A sudden calmness swept over her as the wind caressed her face. She realized that on that wooden platform, everything she had ever been, queen, wife, mother, would come to an end. However, she was also aware that the men who had dragged her there no longer owned her tail. The cart came to a halt. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, resigned first, then his assistants. To assist her in descending, one offered his hand. She looked him in the eyes and said quietly, she said, "No, thank you. I can manage on my own." As the throng roared, she walked down from the wagon, her feet steady and her wrists shackled. The final notes of a sorrowful symphony resounded with each step toward the wooden stairway. Shouts, fists in the air, scornful laughter, and the icy fascination that comes when an era dies in front of thousands of people filled the square. Silent and poised, the guillotine's blade gleamed in the sunlight. It caught Marie Antoinette's attention. She was not afraid. Simply a magnificent, even unearthly calm in their gaze. She walked carefully up the stairs. Her movements were unsteady due to her tied hands, but she refused help. When Sanson, the executioner, moved forward to lead her, fate pulled its final terrible prank. Her foot touched his as she spun around. It all froze for a heartbeat. Just as she said her last words, the executioner looked at her in shock. Soft, almost delicate, and clear. "I apologize, sir. I didn't intentionally do it." No curses, no screams, no desperate appeals. Even those who had gathered to commemorate her passing were taken aback by her straightforward and compassionate apology. Her last victory came from that little, tiny gesture. She lost her children, her identity, her name, and her crown, but in that one breath, the woman regained her dignity, the one thing her adversaries could never take away. She was placed on the wooden plank by the attendants. Anticipation tightened the air surrounding the scaffold. A voice came from somewhere amid the throng. "Let the Republic live on." In unison, many roared back. The signal came from Sanson. The mechanism broke. A metallic, harsh sound. After a heartbeat, the sword fell with deadly accuracy. Her body became still. In front of the crowd, the executioner raised her head by its blonde hair. Across the square came a ferocious cheer. Long live the country. Liberty, long live. It was the revolution's triumph for them. It was a release for her. Later, a few onlookers murmured that they had noticed something strange, a look of calm lingering on her face. A serenity that appeared unaffected by violence. Others said that as if the whole city held its breath, the sky darkened just after the blade fell. Her body was put in a covered carriage with the bodies of the people who had been put to death before her. No coffin, no prayers, no rites. She was brought to Mélines Cemetery and interred with strangers in a mass grave. There was only dirt and silence, no cross to honor her name, no flowers to mark the location. The crowd finally thinned out. The sound of marching boots subsided, leaving just the hollow sound of the trapdoor of the guillotine closing. Some stayed on the rooftops and balconies, unable to believe that history had just changed, gazing at the vacant spot where a queen had fallen. However, that was not the end of her story. Her memories refused to remain beneath, even though they buried her like a criminal. Whispered in the face of death, her silent apology to her executioner gradually evolved into a symbol demonstrating that humanity can persevere even in the face of extreme cruelty. A foreign woman named Marie Antoinette. Accused of all misfortunes, the queen passed away with a grace that no blade could obliterate. Her life was taken by the guillotine, but her soul survived. As soon as the steel hit her throat, the noise of the crowd, the anger, and her own awful time were all overshadowed by her dignity. She took back her rightful throne in that one instant, her immortal second. The shouts subsided as the square cleared. The scaffold was quiet under the dismal skies of Paris. Now unidentified, her body was transported to the Mélines Cemetery, where anonymous tombs engulfed the victims of the revolution. Under the weight of the earth, strangers, thieves, and queens are all equal. No one knew where she lay for years. Her name was purposefully removed from official documents. The revolutionaries thought they had put a permanent end to her story. But it is impossible to bury symbols. As time went on, her passing started to become legendary. A young sculptor was reportedly called in to paint her features after she was executed. Madame Tussaud, whose real name was Marie Groscheltz, had her visage sculpted in wax, as well as plaster. Long after her foes had crumbled to dust, her likeness was kept by a gesture that was born of art and sick fascination. Many of the revolution's founders perished in the process. Robespierre stumbled. Tribunals were disbanded. The guillotine's thunder subsided. The victims gradually became martyrs as France looked for its identity among the ashes. Louis V's 16th brother, who is now King Louis V, ordered a search for the king and queen's remains in 1815, more than 20 years after she passed away. In an obscure area of the two remains were discovered in Méline Cemetery, hidden among nameless bones and hardened earth. Marie Antoinette was recognized by her shackled wrists and pieces of white fabric. At last, her remains were taken to the French king's last burial place, the Basilica of Saint-Denis. Finally, the queen who had been refused a tomb was granted one. But even that wasn't how her narrative really ended. Because something more profound endured despite the monuments, the charges, and the stories. A woman's paradox, who represented both wealth and pain. Marie Antoinette was neither a saint nor the monster that her adversaries had envisioned. She represented a time that had been altered by rage and terror. She was given an odd immortality by those who attempted to obliterate her. Her last deed. As a silent lesson, she apologizes to the man who is planning to murder her. Resistance can take the shape of compassion. The queen lost everything as a result, and her life came to an end. Her identity, her children, and her reign. Nevertheless, as steel and flesh touched in the last heartbeat, she regained her dignity, which no power on earth can take away. Centuries will go by. Empires will fall. We'll forget names. But there will always be a whisper in every story of triumph and failure, in every echo of unfairness. There once was a woman who gracefully faced the world's hatred. If this tale touched you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Though little understood, Marie Antoinette has been condemned for generations. Post your opinions about her in the comments section. Her name is remembered in history. What do you recall her?